Good morning. So, thank you for the song from this young man. And they always say that within our indigenous territories that Indian country is a small world. This young man that sang the song, and he sang a song yesterday. He was in ceremony with us up north in Minnesota, and some other young men. One of my boys was with me, and it was really one of those strong ceremonies when there was a lot of activity going on in the Purification Lodge. And songs are medicine. That is very true. Songs are healing. But the singing of these young men, not only of this man, but the other young men in this lodge, really inspired me that we are not losing our culture as indigenous peoples of the North. That we're not losing the language. And majority of the men in that lodge prayed in their language, which was really, really inspiring for me. And like I said about the songs, these songs that they were singing, not only this young man, but the others. There was a combination of the Anishinaabe songs and our Dakota songs, and each one singing their appropriate songs in this lodge. And like I said, it was really active inside the lodge. And it gave everyone strength. So there's a story to this young man, and who walks what we call the cedar path. Some of you may call it the tobacco road. Some of us call it the red road. Down in the southwest, the corn pollen way. So there's many different interpretations of what some of our people from the south call a good life, the well-being, a good life. And that is the foundation of the intention of the gathering here, is to talk about how do we develop a good way of living in our homelands. And this gathering was put together, as many of you know that have been here from the beginning on the first day, and some came later, and there are some new people here today, and some have left already because they couldn't stay all 3 days. But they came because there's a need for us as indigenous peoples of Turtle Island of North America. Some people call us American Indians. Some people call us First Nations, Aboriginal people of Canada. Some people call us Alaska Natives of Alaska. And a number of years ago, when Native people from this Turtle Island, North America, started to take our issues globally into the framework of the United Nations to address our issues as human rights, but not individual rights, to address our issues as the demand for our collective rights to exist as peoples, with the S on people, very critical, the collective rights that we have. And that was a long journey, extremely long journey, to bring indigenous peoples of many different tribes throughout the world together. And that was a healing process. And when we started to do that, bring our local issues into the global arena within the framework of the United Nations, demanding that the rights of indigenous peoples be recognized, it really created an opportunity for critical analysis and some deep discussions like what we have experienced here. What does that mean for us? And how do we relate to each other, whether it's Inuit from northern Canada, Yupik, Inupiat from Alaska, or Athabascan interior Indigenous peoples in Alaska. And we found that we have diversity. How do people from Alaska relate to those in the framework of the colonization of the United States? For those that are from the lower 48, parallel, and the many tribes in the lower 48. What's our relationship on this political boundary that's been created between Canada and United States? And how do we relate under legal constructions that have been created? And the relationship between our Indigenous peoples of Canada and the Crown has its own story, its own history that is different than our relationship here in the United States with the United States government and how Indian law has been developed. We also were challenged with how do we relate with our Indigenous brothers and sisters from Mexico. And regional definitions in some of the United Nations structures, Mexico is included as a North American region. But yet we have a language difference because their colonizing language was Spanish. So there were many challenges that emerged in all those years. We know that we had elders that went in the early years, elders such as Philip Deere from the Creek Nation of Oklahoma, right south of us, and Leon Shenandoah from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and many others, Thomas Bayaka from the Hopi, that went to the United Nations. And that created a lot of debate and discussion internally here back home, because our framework of reference that had been developed through colonization in terminologies like, for an example, the Indian Reorganization Act. And in Canada, they had their own history on what they were facing with colonial terminologies as far as the relationship between the federal governments and our First Nations. Terminologies and definitions and terms of reference and how we relate to the colonial government structure. So how do we bring that into a global arena? It was very challenging. And part of that involved meeting people from the continent of Africa, learning that there are also indigenous first peoples in India called Adivasis, knowing that there are people, Samis, from the northern areas of Norway and Finland, Sweden, all over, and from the Pacific Islands, Indonesia, Philippines. So it was very challenging. I did not take part in a lot of those meetings, but we had sister organizations such as the International Indian Treaty Council that took part in those meetings, and many others from here in the north and in the south. So the definitions and terms of reference around terminology, there was a lot of debate on rights. And I fully understand how we are revisiting that terminology. It just took me back in memory from many of the stories I heard of indigenous people coming together in Geneva, in Switzerland at the United Nations, debating the terminology of rights. Because in many of the indigenous languages, there was no word for rights. We know that. It's written in books. In interventions, they call it interventions when you raise your indigenous sign to be recognized to speak. That's an intervention. In many of the interventions, that question was brought up. Is how do we express our struggles in these arenas to where there is a language difference? And how do we take advantage of opportunities that may arise? And these indigenous peoples took advantage of the situation to develop a framework of recognition on a global scale of the rights of indigenous peoples with the S. And there's a long history of trying to understand the resistance of governments like United States and Canada and others that did not want to recognize the collective rights of indigenous peoples who protested the S on people for so many years. And the corporations standing in the background and the lobbying force of these corporations, whether it's extractive industry, including the logging companies, mining industry, oil, but also industries tied to the pharmaceutical industry and many other industries that also felt threatened by this new movement throughout the world of recognizing the S on peoples, the collective rights, and the funding that they put forward to keep the politicians from recognizing the expression of our full self-determination as indigenous peoples. Here we use the word sovereignty. Here in the United States, we work on our rights and jurisdiction to manage and to control our territories from contamination to develop economic development and many other services, housing, social services, law enforcement. And the list goes on of the responsibilities our tribal chiefs have here in the United States. The legal structures of indigenous peoples in the South may be different as well. So we learned a lot. And I wanted to bring that forward a little bit, not for open discussion on that piece, but just to bring up the need to have a term of reference on how we have dialogue. I think many of us who are native here, who are indigenous, understand what I'm talking about because we live it every day. The past 2 days, many of you who may not come from the heart of our community may not fully understand, but are beginning to understand that historical trauma that indigenous peoples bear. And then maybe, and that's not to take away from your own personal struggles you may feel when we use the terminology settlers, immigrants. But like I mentioned with one of the stories that I heard years ago when the Kogi from Colombia sent a message to the world as the older brothers and the older sisters of their homeland to the settlers, the younger brothers who immigrated to their homeland in South America, of a message that something has to change, that they're feeling the effects of climate, they're feeling the effects of ecological destruction, they're feeling the effects of some things that now we're starting to express on how economics, the financial reality of the world does create burden on how we conduct our activities as human beings that may have effect and negative effect on the ecosystems of the world. But they put that message out. They're calling for those people who are the settlers to take responsibility. Somehow change the way that you are living, because it's having effect on the well-being of who we are. So it reminds me of a friend of mine in the Great Lakes, Anishinaabe man that passed away. Some of you from the Great Lakes or nationally, you may remember this man. Some people called him an environmentalist. He did not like that word. His name was Walter Prissett. Walt Prissett, one of the founders of the Midwest Treaty Network in Wisconsin. But he worked with many non-indigenous peoples, the Witnesses for Nonviolence in defense of the indigenous peoples of Wisconsin fighting for their fishing rights, where the racism was so extreme that people you grew up with were calling you names as you were defending your right to the fish. But I mentioned him because we used to speak at Oregon at the Law, Air, and Water Conference, Law Conference. It's one of the first places I met Steve Newcomb in Oregon at that law conference. Walt Prissett used to go over there. We used to speak. So he was in an auditorium like this, and he was speaking about treaty rights in Wisconsin and the struggle to protect Mother Earth, the environment. And I had finished my presentation. I came to check on Walt Prissett, and the auditorium was full. And he was laying on the table with the microphone, and that's Walt Prissett. You know, he's laying on the table on his back. Then he got up all of a sudden, and he did something, and he said, "I'm going to adopt you all. You are Native Americans now." And I was standing by the door, and I said, "Oh no, Walt Prissett, what are you doing?" Now they're going to be demanding, Native rights and maybe opening up a casino. But he had a reason. And he gave this justification. He says, "I'm tired. I've been fighting the fight since I've been a little boy, not only with the effects of historical trauma, but I'm trying to protect the homeland where I live. The water is contaminated. You keep coming in and logging out our trees. And there's toxic chemicals going down the railroad tracks. Now we're hearing about chemicals and toxics in the environment that are going into the breast milk of our women." And he started to lay out the list. He says, "I'm tired. I've been to Europe, and people are organizing to protect their homeland in Europe. If there's a shipment of nuclear waste, tens of thousands of people rally to organize to stop that." He says, "I don't know what's wrong here, but this is your land as well." And I was standing by the doorway, and again, I was kind of like, "Oh no, where are you taking this?" But he says, "You have to bear responsibility, and don't just leave it on me because I'm getting sick. I cannot convince the people to change their ways. So that's why I'm adopting you as Native Americans, to take responsibility for Wisconsin, to take responsibility for protecting the trees and the water, to protect Mother Earth. I'm tired. I'm fighting your corporations. I'm fighting your laws, state laws and federal laws. We're always looking for an angle to win the battle. And I'm tired." So I think of that over this topic of rights of Mother Earth. If Walt was alive, he probably would say, "Tom, there's something to what they're doing. That these are the people not like us. They do not have that story of our connection to Mother Earth. A lot of them come from over there in Europe. But they're starting to understand something. Work with them. Let's see if it's going to work. And me, having a responsibility as the director of a vast indigenous network around environmental justice issues, I'm always cautious. Red flags always go up. So in the work that we do, we don't hastily go into developing alliances with non-indigenous peoples. But those of you who know about the network, we have strategically looked around for this. So I wanted to give some background to this because we've been on a journey for the past 2 days, and we needed to have this kind of like, I wanted to give this background. We have been on a journey. We did something interesting yesterday when we combined our indigenous and our non-indigenous brothers and sisters with some challenges. And this gathering is and was developed for our indigenous peoples to talk about this concept of rights of nature, rights of Mother Earth. So there's 2 questions that have come up, and I'm going to invite Ben Price and Shannon up here, and if they can we need another chair up here and have them sit up the table, because we pulled out 2 questions that have come up consistently the past 2 days. Maybe, okay, you can sit here. I'm going to switch over to that mic. Yeah, just have a seat. Those 2 chairs, let's take those 2 chairs. So before we could go on today, there were 2 questions that I think are very critical. And you can work out who responds. Now, one of the concerns that have been coming up around this concept of rights of nature, rights of Mother Earth, is that this movement within the indigenous peoples here in the United States and Canada is really strong on protection of our rights, our treaty rights, our self-determination. And with these, there's concern about, for an example, could this rights of nature movement, and for an example, non-native, non-indigenous environmental organizations be able to utilize this rights of nature initiative against a tribe, for an example, that comes from a whaling culture, and that's a spiritual relationship that many of our coastal tribes have to whales. And some people call it subsistence rights, but it's deeper than subsistence rights, not just for the food. And many of our indigenous peoples of the Pacific Coast, for an example, go out and have had to fight for that. And there have been some environmental organizations that have fought them on that right. And so could this be used as a tool of environmental organizations to oppose them on their rights for whaling? Another question is, many of our indigenous peoples are hunters. Or we gather, or we make beautiful items that we wear. The other day I had the porcupine quill with my bear design. So if I go out and capture a porcupine, and respecting my own way that I make an offering to that porcupine, and I use that porcupine quill, could someone come and say that porcupine has rights and you violated the rights of that porcupine? So in this concept of rights of nature, rights of Mother Earth, please explain to more in insight what this means. Because I understand that how this alliance, global alliance, is addressing this, that you have a response to that. So can you share that with us? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you all. My name is Shannon Biggs, and I work with an organization called Global Exchange. We are based in the San Francisco Bay Area, the land of the Ohlone people. I want to thank Tom Goldtooth, IEN, and Haskell University for allowing me to be here, and also for allowing me to grace your stage. I've learned so much since I've been here already, and I'm pleased to be able to share a little bit about the work that we do, and look forward to hopefully building stronger alliances that will allow us to be able to support you through global exchange, through the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund in this work. If it is something that is of interest to you, the questions that you asked, Tom, are questions that we deal with in all kinds of communities, and specifically the work that I do and the work that I partner with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund to do is to assist communities, native or non-native communities, to assert their rights as communities, to make governing decisions about things that directly affect them in the places where they live. And that means, for example, in Nevada City, California, the government and corporations standing behind the government to tell them what food and farming will look like in their community. And those farms selling or giving or sharing things like raw milk, or having a farm that has both chickens and cows in the same place. Those farms can be subject to being raided by federal and state agencies as illegal. This is unjust law. And communities are beginning to recognize that as communities, only they should be the ones to decide what happens in the place where they live. After all, they're the ones who are affected. And so to the second question first, and I'm just going to answer these really briefly, and then I will pass it over to Ben to also address these questions. The right to practice traditional ways is the right of your communities. Rights of nature is meant to, is a way to also enhance and to support those natural ways of being and living with the land. This is not a tool for anyone to come and challenge your sovereignty as communities. And in fact, in the non-native communities where we work, where they have used rights of nature provisions in the law, where they have created laws, they've used the rights of nature aspect in practical ways. And some communities may not even see this rights of nature as something, as a broader understanding of their relationship with the rest of nature. Not yet. We have a lot to learn from our native brothers and sisters, a lot to learn. But we meet communities who are beginning to look for new solutions and new answers. And rights of nature combined with their community rights, when they put those together to say, we're going to determine whether it's an issue of fracking and that they don't want fracking in their community, whether it's an issue of farming and what they want to determine what food and farming looks like in their community. Rights of nature is a companion, as it should be, whether it's community sovereignty or whether it's indigenous tribal sovereignty. These things are meant to go hand in hand, because the rights of Mother Earth are also our human rights. You cannot use the rights of Mother Earth to reduce the rights of the community and the right of the community to make decisions about how they live their lives in harmony and in balance with Mother Earth. These ordinances are meant to not just establish that, but to assert that and to challenge existing laws that say you can't do that. Those existing laws, federal and state, are unjust. We use the law as a way to, we write laws that challenge the laws that tell us how we're going to live and how we're going to submit to unnatural ways of living in harmony or not in harmony with the earth. The fact that mountaintop removal is legal is insane. It is insane. And what rights do communities have who live there to say, not only will we speak for ourselves, to say no to things like that, but are we not the people who are stewards of this local ecosystem? Do we not have the right to speak for our local ecosystem and to speak for the trees, to speak for the water, to act as stewards about what the balance looks like? We know when the butterflies come. We know when the natural cycles of this place, and those communities that live closest and live in harmony with those practices should be the ones to be making governing decisions about what that looks like. These laws are absolutely not put in place anywhere to tell communities what kinds of natural practices and what kind of ways to live in harmony. No, you can't. You can't make decisions about porcupines. The natural cycle of life is what's being protected. This isn't about somebody telling the lion you can't eat the antelope. That's not what's being protected here. That antelope isn't what's being protected. It is the cycle, the natural cycle of life and the cycle of ecosystems that are being protected, and corporations are never going to do that. The rights and privileges that corporations are granted are unnatural. Rights come by virtue of being born, and our human rights come from creation as well. Those rights, whether we're talking about whatever word we use, and we use rights because that's the language of the law, and we're challenging that. We know this is the beginning of the work, and eventually we will get past using words like rights. We have a long way to go, and this is the beginning of the journey, is to be challenging the existing system and putting in place something more along the lines of what we really think life should look like and how we should be living. In terms of the subsistence farming or subsistence fishing, that's a natural process. If anything, rights of nature laws would be used by tribes to stop commercial fishing, corporate fishing, from interfering with their natural right to fish in a subsistence way. And I know Ben has more to say and to add, but I thank you for allowing me to be here, to join you, and to join this conversation, because ultimately the work we do, whether we call it rights of nature, or whether you continue to teach us what other words we might be looking for in the future as we move through this work, we have already, this concept comes from indigenous teachings, and we have a lot to learn about how to reconnect with our original instructions. So we thank you for that.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello again. Again, my name is Ben Price, and the organization that I work with daily with community organizing is the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And to try to answer quickly the questions that Tom posed, very simply, rights of nature as we, yes, thank you. Rights of nature as we define it in the community laws that we are invited to write for the communities that contact us. They are not about animal rights. It's not about copying the notion of individual rights and putting that in place for individual species or animals. That I can understand might be a misunderstanding of what we're about. And particularly in indigenous communities, subsistence communities, that would be a major concern. We hear a similar concern in the non-indigenous communities where people say, oh, these crazy environmentalists, they want to make a law that says we're not allowed to go deer hunting, or we're not allowed to cut down a tree on our property. We hear those concerns, and they're not part of the concept of rights of nature as we frame them in the community laws that we draft for communities. In fact, they are very much more akin to what Tom was talking about. Collective rights, the rights of whole natural communities and ecosystems. And we use the terms the right to exist, to flourish, to naturally evolve, to regenerate. They're not individual rights. It is really, as Shannon indicated, about systems, natural systems. And when we use the term right, and I've learned a lot being here about what that term, that word evokes. And when I think about it, frankly, when I think about it, it's really more in terms of our responsibility to those natural systems, to those natural communities and ecosystems, so that laws of the United States today are illegitimate because they treat nature, natural communities and processes as though they can be property, as though they can be owned, and that the so-called property rights of the owner empowers that one person or that one corporation with the authority to destroy those ecosystems or those rights. That's a false understanding of human beings' relationship with the earth, and we acknowledge that. And quite frankly, if I have the opportunity, I won't go too much longer here to answer this question, but we need to understand when we talk about community rights and the work that Shannon and myself and our colleagues do, we call it community rights organizing because what we're doing, and we're putting the rights of nature in the context of that kind of organizing. It is one of the elements. Because we need to actually understand that human beings live in nature. And as opposed to Western philosophies and traditions, we're not apart from nature. We're not above nature. We can't own nature. And the laws that say that we can are false. And honestly, the work we're doing is very much the very beginnings, trying to lay down some stepping stones. We understand that getting one community here and there to adopt local laws that say, here are community rights, the right for people to have clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. Here are the rights of nature, the right not to be destroyed, the right to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve, and other rights that are enumerated. putting those in place in one little community, we understand will not change everything. It needs to happen in many places, and we see this as community directed by peoples with that S on the end, the people in a place taking responsibility for protecting the people and the place where they live, using at the moment the tool that seems to carry some weight, and that is law. Rights being what I would describe as the highest law. Rights being laws that environmental laws can't trump, can't preempt, that state laws can't trump, can't preempt, can't overcome. Those rights being the law of the community, not of the government, not something that's made up above and then imposed down below. And that's really the vision of how we see these laws coming into effect, with the people coming together in the places where they live, making them law, and not taking the existing law as legitimate and turning their backs on it.
As one of the co-conveners, I'm going to do something right now that the committee may frown at me, but is there anyone that has a question? And I'm going to limit it to 2 questions from the audience related to the questions and concerns that have been expressed by Indigenous peoples. So, Dennis Martinez, can you come up, please? So that's one. If someone else has a question, please raise their hand. Steve Newcomb. So I'm sorry. That's the 2. Dennis, why don't you come up here real quick around the back so people can hear you. You're in the side of our video up there. Again, this is being broadcast throughout the world. We had so many people on that first day and yesterday that it overwhelmed our system. So people in the audience of the world, hope you're watching. Thank you very much. And Dennis Martinez. Please be very specific on your questions. And we're going to have representatives from Ecuador, Indigenous peoples, who have been part of this movement after this panel. Thank you.
I grew up in a hunting and fishing subsistence family. And one thing I learned in working with Indigenous peoples all over the world is that if you compare what Fish and Game or Canadian Department of Oceans or whatever agency says about populations of animals and their viability, in just about 99% of the time, they're way off. They're wrong. The reason that they're wrong is that people who live on the land understand the land. They've had generations. They have a strong cultural memory and sensitivity to change. So time after time, after talking about caribou counts, bowhead whale counts, even porcupines, okay. Now, if there's an endangered porcupine, if suddenly there's no porcupines, as where I live in the Klamath Mountains, and the tribes decides, knowledge specialists, knowledge holders, decide this is not a good year to kill porcupines. Let's wait till next year. If there's no salmon run, this is not a good year. So let's hold off on salmon. But when there are good runs, then we can take a lot of salmon. This happened 2 years ago up in Canada. So my question is, given that possible conflict of, quote, the rights of nature, being that you have an endangered species in the eyes of the institutions and agencies, and on the other side, the Indigenous people say, no, we know how many deer are fawning, we know where they're fawning, we had to tell the Forest Service where they're fawning. This happened with Klamath. How do you approach that problem? Because it's a tendency among Westerners to dismiss Indian conservation ethics, the consciousness to decide from year to year what's available and what's not available. That regulatory structure I'm talking about was the key to conservation in indigenous communities. Okay?
Thank you very much. What I would say is that rights of nature is not being represented in laws like the Endangered Species Act. Rights of nature is not in that law. And regulatory law is not meant to protect rights of nature or even human communities. What it does is it protects financial and commercial interests. What I think about, for instance, the Endangered Species Act, as much as environmentalists might love it, and I don't, by the way, call myself an environmentalist. Many times, the biggest obstacle to our organizing in the non-indigenous communities are the environmentalists who are organized, and they are funded to perpetuate their organizations more than they are to perpetuate the rights of nature. We reject that. In terms of endangered species, the commercial side of that seems to me to be the whole idea of scarcity, that those animals become valuable suddenly in law because they're scarce, the way that gold is considered to be valuable because it's scarce. That would be not a system that it comports with the rights of nature as we're talking about it. And community rights, again, is the core. And the rights of nature is within the purview of the community to decide. And so very much I don't see a disconnect. And I think that the wisdom of the people living in a particular place would be the regulatory body, if you will.
Just one more comment. We are nature.
Yes.
Excellent question, Dennis Martinez. Steve Newcomb. He's our last question, and then our sister from Ecuador is going to be coming up next. And if Marlon wants to sit up here too, be good.
Yeah. Good morning. My question has to do with the Charter of Nature from 1982, which, from what I understand, began the discussion of the rights of nature, and it is actually contextualized in terms of states and in terms of civilization and human beings. It's interesting from looking at it from an indigenous peoples or nations perspective. It's interesting to look at the word civilization in the dictionary, because it actually means the act of civilizing, especially the forcing of a particular cultural pattern on a population to whom it is foreign, which is another example of a domination framework. I guess the interesting thing that I'm curious about with regard to the discussion of rights of nature is it seems to me that it's an effort to deal with the domination or dominant system as a type of shield or protection. For example, the effort in the international arena to actually create a framework that would provide human rights, collective and individual, for indigenous nations and peoples seems to me to be parallel to the effort to create a rights regime for nature and Mother Earth and so forth. And I'm just curious how you think that will, I'm not necessarily criticizing the idea, I'm trying to get clarity on how that is going to provide something that isn't already existing in the current domination system. In other words, trying to use the domination system, or what I call the domination conceptual system of law, to actually protect ourselves from that same system. So in other words, using something that emerges out of that system in an effort to shield ourselves from that same system that it's a product of. I hope that's clear enough.
Just quickly, and I know we're supposed to be really brief, but Global Exchange and the Legal Defense Fund both look for root causes of injustice in the work that we do. And we also look at the system of governance that we have as one of a corporate state. and that the government works by and for the interests of large corporations. What we're achieving to accomplish is to challenge the laws that empower corporations to do what they do and impose their view of the way that we should live, whether it's on native land or whether it's on non-native land. That they use the power of the law. Laws are really how we use power to assert our worldview, how we use power to enshrine our values. Right now, the values of our system of laws have nothing to do with living in harmony with nature and diversity, whether biodiversity, whether it's cultural diversity. The root cause of climate change is the way that we, when we look at even climate change, we say climate change is a symptom of how we treat Mother Earth, and that's all coming back to roost. All of the activities that relate to climate change are mostly the biggest problem are those things that are legal within our system. What if we challenge those root systems of law to create the kind of governance that is needed to live in harmony and in balance with the rest of species, human, winged, everything? Those systems of law are how corporations use power to impose a non-natural system of governance upon us, native and non-native. We are challenging that system of law by asserting our rights to make those kinds of decisions for ourselves, and to say it doesn't matter what the federal government says speaks on behalf of corporations to impose those things upon us. We will make those decisions as communities who live in balance with nature. We will write our own systems of law at the community level. We are challenging those systems of law.
Very quickly. 100% agree. This is about communities making decisions and being stewards of their own relationship with Earth. And it is confusing because it looks like we're using law and that this is a legal strategy. And I just want to say, it may sound counterintuitive, but it is actually not strictly a legal strategy. This is an organizing strategy. It wasn't a legal strategy in 1963 when some young people went into the Woolworth's lunch counter and sat down and ordered lunch. They thought they knew, they didn't think, they knew they already had the right, the same right as white people to do it. And so they went in and they ordered lunch. And they were denied, of course. They didn't expect to win just because they were right that first time. And then they did it again, and they did it again. And they used other strategies, refusing to give up seats at the front of the bus. These ordinances, these local laws that our organizations assist communities to draft, that assert fundamental rights, and then prohibit corporations from doing things like fracking, because that would violate those rights. And I mean the rights of the people and of nature, because these ordinances have the rights of the people and of nature right in the Bill of Rights. And the prohibitions are there to protect those rights of that community, not to protect the property privileges of corporations as federal and state law does. So we are seeing communities begin to challenge state and federal law, to say that is illegitimate law because if it preempts, regulates, or nullifies rights that people and nature have in themselves just because they exist, those laws are illegitimate and we needn't follow them. And so we're going to sit down at the lunch counter of law and say, we will be served and we won't be denied. And we'll be back if you deny us today. We'll be back tomorrow. And more people will join us because they saw what happened when you denied those perfectly legitimate logical, sane rights. You said we can't have them. It's an organizing tool. And we have communities that have passed laws that challenge state and federal law, that challenge them to say these rights are fundamental. And we are going to make law here in the community where we live. It's the only place we can, because the corporations run the government, because property values and property privileges are the only rights, and they're not rights, they're privileges, but that's the only law that the law sees anymore, not the rights of people and nature. Challenging is the only way to change things as we understand it. We may be wrong, but my experience is, and what I've seen in my lifetime is, and historically what we've seen is, that unless injustice and oppression are challenged, they will not simply yield. They will not simply turn the tables and say, oops, we were wrong. We need to say, we won't tolerate the destruction of the earth, and the people are part of the earth.
Thank you.